Chapter 2 introduces Silverbush. Part 1. Pat's brook-brown eyes had been staring through the little round window in the wall above the landing until Judy had made her mysterious remark about the parsley bed. It was her favorite window, opening outward like the porthole of a ship. She never went up to Judy's room without stopping to look from it. Dear little fitful breezes came to that window that never came anywhere else, and you saw such lovely things out of it. The big grove of white birch on the hill behind it, which gave Silverbush its name, and which was full of dear little screech owls that hardly ever screeched, but purred and laughed. Beyond it all the dells and slopes and field of the old farm, some of them fenced in with the barbed wire Pat hated, others still surrounded by the snake fences of silvery gray longers, with goldenrod and aster thick in their angles. Pat loved every field on the farm. She and Sidney had explored every one of them together. To her, they were not just fields. They were persons. The big hill field that was in wheat this spring was now like a huge green carpet. The field of the pool, which had in its very center a dimple of water, as if some giantess, when Earth was young, had pressed the tip of her finger down into the soft ground. It was framed all summer in daisies and blue flags, and she and Sid bathed their hot, tired little feet there on sultry days. The mince pie field, which was a triangle of land running up into the spruce bush. The swampy buttercup field, where all the buttercups in the world bloomed. The field of farewell summers, which in September would be dotted all over with clumps of purple asters. The secret field, away at the back, which you couldn't see at all and would never suspect was there until you had gone through the woods, as she and Sid had daringly done one day, and come upon it suddenly, completely surrounded by maple and fir woods, basking in a pool of sunshine, scented by the breath of the spice ferns that grew in golden clumps around it. Its feathery bent grasses were starred with the red of wild strawberry leaves, and there were some piles of large stones here and there, with bracken growing in their crevices and clusters of long-stemmed strawberries all around their bases. That was the first time Pat had ever picked a bouquet of strawberries. In the corner by which they entered were two dear little spruces, one just a hand's breadth taller than the other, brother and sister, just like Sidney and her. Wood Queen and Fern Princess, they had named them instantly. Or rather, Pat did. She loved to name things. It made them just like people you loved. They loved the secret field better than all the other fields. It seemed somehow to belong to them, as if they had been the first to discover it. It was so different from the poor, bleak, little stony field behind the barn that nobody loved. Nobody except Pat. She loved it because it was a Silverbush field. That was enough for Pat. But the fields were not all that could be seen from that charming window on this delightful spring evening when the sky in the west was all golden and soft pink, and Judy's dim was creeping down out of the silver bush. There was the hill of the mist to the east, a little higher than the hill of the Silverbush, with 3 Lombardies on its very top, like grim, black, faithful watchmen. Pat loved that hill dreadfully hard, although it wasn't on Silverbush land, quite a mile away, in fact, and she didn't know to whom it belonged, in one sense. That is, in another she knew it was hers because she loved it so much. Every morning she waved a hand of greeting to it from her window. Once, when she was only 5, she remembered going to spend the day with the great-aunts at the Bayshore farm, and how frightened she had been lest the hill of the mist might be moved while she was away. What a joy it had been to come home and find it still there, in its place with its 3 poplars untouched, reaching up to a great full moon above them. She was now, at nearly 7, so old and wise that she knew the hill of the mist would never be moved. It would always be there. Go where she would, return when she might. This was comforting in a world which Pat was already beginning to suspect was full of a terrible thing called change. And another terrible thing, which she was not yet old enough to know, was disillusionment. She only knew that whereas a year ago she had firmly believed that if she could climb to the top of the Hill of the Mist, she might be able to touch that beautiful shining sky, perhaps, oh rapture, pick a trembling star from it. She knew now that nothing of the sort was possible. Sidney had told her this, and she had to believe Sid, who, being a year older than herself, knew so much more than she did. Pat thought nobody knew as much as Sidney, except, of course, Judy Plum, who knew everything. It was Judy who knew that the wind spirits lived on the Hill of the Mist. It was the highest hill for miles around, and the wind spirits did always be liking high points. Pat knew what they looked like, though nobody had ever told her, not even Judy, who thought it safer not to be after describing the creatures. Pat knew the north wind was a cold, glittering spirit, and the east wind a gray, shadowy one, but the spirit of the west wind was a thing of laughter, and the south wind a thing of song. The kitchen garden was just below the window, with Judy's mysterious parsley bed in one corner, and beautiful orderly rows of onions and beans and peas. The well was beside the gate, the old-fashioned open well with a handle and roller and a long rope with a bucket at its end, which the gardeners kept to appease Judy, who simply wouldn't hear of any new-fangled pump being put in. Sure, and the water would never be the same again. Pat was glad Judy wouldn't let them change the old well. It was beautiful, with great ferns growing out all the way down its sides from the crevices of the stones that lined it, almost hiding from sight the deep, clear water 50 feet below, which always mirrored a bit of blue sky, and her own little face looking up at her from those away untroubled depths. Even in the winter, the ferns were there, long and green, and always the mirrored Patricia, looking up at her from a world where tempests never blew. A big maple grew over the well, a maple that reached with green arms to the house, every year a little nearer. Pat could see the orchard, too, a most extraordinary orchard with spruce trees and apple trees delightfully mixed up together, in the old part at least. The new part was trim and cultivated and not half so interesting. In the old part were trees that great-grandfather Gardner had planted, and trees that had never been planted at all but just grew, with delightful little paths crisscrossing all over it. At the far end was a corner full of young spruces with a tiny sunny glade in the midst of them, where several beloved cats lay buried, and where Pat went when she wanted to think things out. Things sometimes have to be thought out, even at nearly 7. Part 2. At one side of the orchard was the graveyard. Yes, truly a graveyard, where great-great-grandfather Nehemiah Gardner, who had come out to P.E. Island in 1780, was buried, and likewise his wife, Marie Bonnet, a French Huguenot lady. Great-grandfather Thomas Gardner was there too, with his Quaker bride Jane Wilson. They had been buried there, where the nearest graveyard was across the island at Charlottetown, only to be reached by a bridle path through the woods. Jane Wilson was a demure little lady who always wore Quaker gray and a prim plain cap. One of her caps was still in a box in the Silver Bush attic. She it was who had fought off the big black bear trying to get in at the window of their log cabin by pouring scalding hot mush on its face. Pat loved to hear Judy tell that story and describe how the bear had torn away through the stumps back of the cabin, pausing every once in so long for a frantic attempt to scrape the mush off its face. Those must have been exciting days in P.E. Island, when the woods were alive with bears, and they would come to put their paws on the banking of the houses and look in at the windows. What a pity that could never happen now, because there were no bears left. Pat always felt sorry for the last bear. How lonesome he must have been. Great-Uncle Richard was there, Wild Dick Gardner, who had been a sailor and had fought with sharks, and was reputed to have once eaten human flesh. He had sworn he would never rest on land. When he lay dying of measles, of all things for a daredevil sailor to die of, he had wanted his brother Thomas to promise to take him out in a boat and bury him under the waters of the Gulf. But scandalized Thomas would do nothing of the sort and buried Dick in the family plot. As a result, whenever any kind of misfortune was going to fall on the Gardners, Wild Dick used to rise up and sit on the fence and sing his rake-helly songs until his sober, God-fearing kinsfolk had to come out of their graves and join him in the chorus. At least, this was one of Judy Plum's most thrilling yarns. Pat never believed it, but she wished she could. Weeping Willie's grave was there, too. Nehemiah's brother, who, when he first came to Pea Island and saw all the huge trees that had to be cleared away, had sat down and cried. It was never forgotten. Weeping Willie he was to his death and after, and no girl could be found willing to be Mrs. Weeping Willie. So he lived his 80 years out in sour old bachelorhood, and, so Judy said, when good fortune was to befall his race, Weeping Willie sat on his flat tombstone and wept. And Pat couldn't believe that either, but she wished Weeping Willie could come back and see what was in the place of the lonely forest that had frightened him, if he could see Silverbush now. Then there was the mystery grave. On the tombstone, the inscription, "To my own dear Emily and our little Lillian." Nothing more, not even a date. Who was Emily? Not one of the Gardners, that was known. Perhaps some neighbor had asked the privilege of burying his dear dead near him in the Gardner plot, where she might have company in the lone new land. And how old was little Lillian? Pat thought if any of the Silverbush ghosts did walk, she wished it might be Lillian. She wouldn't be the least afraid of her. There were many children buried there. Nobody knew how many because there were no stone for any of them. The great grates had horizontal slabs of red sandstone from the shore propped on 4 legs over them, with all their names and virtues inscribed thereon. The grass grew about them thick and long and was never disturbed. On summer afternoons the sandstone slabs were always hot, and Gentleman Tom loved to lie there, beautifully folded up in slumber. A paling fence, which Judy Plum whitewashed scrupulously every spring, surrounded the plot, and the apples that fell onto the graveyard from overhanging boughs were never eaten. "It wouldn't be respectful," explained Judy. They were gathered up and given to the pigs. Pat could never understand why, if it wasn't respectful to eat those apples, it was any more respectful to feed them to the pigs. She was very proud of the graveyard and very sorry the Gardners had given up being buried there. It would be so nice, Pat thought, to be buried right at home, so to speak, where you could hear the voices of your own folks every day and all the nice sounds of home. Nice sounds such as Pat could hear now through the little round window. The whir of the grindstone as Father sharpened an axe under the sweet apple tree. A dog barking his head off somewhere over at Uncle Tom's. The west wind rustling in the trembling poplar leaves. The saw-wheats calling in the silverbush. Judy said they were calling for rain. Judy's big white gobbler lording it about the yard. Uncle Tom's geese talking back and forth to the silverbush geese. The pigs squealing in their pens. Even that was pleasant, because they were silverbush pigs. The Thursday kitten mewing to be led into the granary. Somebody laughing. Winnie, of course. What a pretty little laugh Winnie had. And Joe whistling around the barns. Joe did whistle so beautifully, and half the time he didn't know he was whistling. Hadn't he once started to whistle in church? But that was a story for Judy Plum to tell. Judy, take her own word for it, had never been the same again. The barns where Joe was whistling near the orchard, with only the whispering lane that led to Uncle Tom's between them. The little barn stood close to the big barn like a child. Such an odd little barn with gables and a tower and oriel windows like a church, which was exactly what it was. When the new Presbyterian church had been built in South Glen, Grandfather Gardner had bought the old one and hauled it home for a barn. It was the only thing he had ever done of which Judy Plum hadn't approved. It was only what she expected when he had a stroke 5 years later at the age of 75, and was never the same again, though he lived to be 80. And say what you might, There hadn't been the same luck among the Silverbush pigs after the sty was shifted to the old church. They became subject to rheumatism. The sun had set. Pat always liked to watch its western glory reflected in the windows of Uncle Tom's house beyond the Whispering Lane. It was the hour she liked best of all the hours on the farm. The poplar leaves were rustling silkily in the afterlight. The yard below was suddenly full of dear, round, fat, furry pussy cats, bent on making the most of the cat's light. Silverbush always overflowed with kittens. Nobody ever had the heart to drown them. Pat especially was fond of them. It was a story Judy loved to tell, how the minister had told Pat, age 4, that she could ask him any question she liked. Pat had said sadly, "Why don't Gentleman Tom have kittens?" The poor man did be resigning at the next presbytery. He had a tendency to laughing, and he said he couldn't preach with little Pat Gardner looking at him from her pew, so solemn-like and reproachful. In the yard were Black Sunday, Spotted Monday, Maltese Tuesday, Yellow Wednesday, Calico Friday, Saturday, who was just the color of the twilight. Only Striped Thursday continued to wail heartbrokenly at the granary door. Thursday had always been an unsociable kitten, walking by himself like Kipling's cat in Joe's storybook. The old gobbler, with its coral red wattles, had gone to roost on the orchard fence. Bats were swooping about. Fairies rode on bats, Judy said. Lights were springing up suddenly to east and west, at Ned Bakers's, and Kenneth Robinson's, and Duncan Gardner's, and James Adams's. Pat loved to watch them and wonder what was going on in the rooms where they bloomed. But there was one house in which there was never any light, an old white house among thick firs on the top of a hill to the southwest, 2 farms away from Silverbush. It was a long, rather low house. Pat called it the Long Lonely House. It hadn't been lived in for years. Pat always felt so sorry for it, especially in the dim, when the lights sprang up in all the other houses over the countryside. It must feel lonely and neglected. Somehow she resented the fact that it didn't have all the houses had. "It wants to be lived in, Judy," she would say wistfully. There was the evening star in a pale silvery field of sky just over the tall fir tree that shot up in the very center of the Silverbush. The first star always gave her a thrill. Wouldn't it be lovely if she could fly up to that dark swaying fir top between the evening star and the darkness?